Well, I'd like to start by thanking our hosts here, all the conference organizers, Trevor, the translators, everybody who has helped me do complicated things like buy a subway ticket or order dinner, which, not speaking Portuguese, have been more challenging than I would have liked. And I'm very excited, but I want to particularly thank Trevor for the role he's played in convening these conferences, not just this year, but over the last many years. The story of the Drivers Cooperative, my organization, is actually very woven together with the story of the Platform Cooperative Consortium and the theory of platform cooperativism. I think Trevor is our Marx, and I could maybe hope to be a lowly subordinate of Trotsky or something like that in this revolutionary movement. I should be so lucky. So let me begin by giving some background on who I am and what the Drivers Cooperative is. So the picture you see here was taken on May 1st, 2021. During a ceremony that was held in Flushing Meadows Corona Park. That's a big park in New York City and Queens, where our cooperative was officially issuing shares to the drivers who had come together to launch this co-op. That was our beginning. At this time, we did not have any operations. We were not doing any trips. We had recruited about 2,500 drivers to join the platform and join the project. We had very little money. I think in the scheme of things, we had secured a loan for about $200,000, which that's actually quite a lot of money, and it's especially a lot of money when you have to pay it back. It's a very scary moment, but we weren't operating as a company. Today, the Drivers Cooperative has signed up 7,500 drivers in New York City. So far this year, we have paid out $4.5 million in wages to drivers. Of the drivers who've enrolled, about 200 drivers are making their living with the co-op, so not all drivers are active, but we're providing the co-op provides high-quality jobs for hundreds of drivers at this point. And we've signed up 40,000 riders who've downloaded our app. And so a lot has happened since this photo was taken. So today, I'd like to share with you the background of this story, what happened, and hopefully discuss some of the challenges we've faced and some of the challenges ahead, and hopefully begin to draw some lessons that may be useful in the different contexts all of us are in for all the amazing projects here of building platform cooperatives. So let me begin then, and I'm going to have some slides, but I think I've been hearing things and thinking throughout this conference, and so I'm going to kind of go off the script a little bit. I hope that's okay. Does this control the slides? No, it does not. Oh, it does. Oh, okay, it does control the slides. That's great. So it's one thing that's been really interesting here has been there are many different entry points into this world of platform cooperativism. Some of us here are researchers or scholars. Others of us are activists. Some of us here are technologists. Some of us are lawyers. We're all looking at the problems created by the world of big tech from different professional and personal perspectives and from different points of view in the world. My entry point into this whole world was from the labor movement. So just tell a little bit of my story because it's very bound up with the co-op. About 15 years ago, I got to work trying to unionize the place that I worked at in college, a company called Starbucks. We've probably all heard of it, right? I was fired for doing that. A lot of my coworkers were fired. The campaign wasn't very successful. Back at that time, in the early 2000s, the fast food industry was sort of the worst job that most people in the United States could kind of imagine. Minimum wage, you would be paid no more than the federal minimum. Looking back, what I don't think most of us realized at that time, at the exact same time as workers in the US were beginning to struggle to unionize the fast food industry, that's a movement that kind of blew up in 2012, around that exact same time, the CEOs of Silicon Valley were hatching schemes to create even worse jobs, to create the area of the economy known as the gig economy or platform economy. At exactly that time, they were creating a company called Uber, in which, as many people here have already mentioned, the model is to use technology in order to provide consumers with greater convenience, but to profit by exploiting workers more severely than they would be under the standard framework of employment. That's the whole game, right? So while the labor movement was struggling to catch up with the last wave of capitalism, of unionizing the fast food industry, the captains of industry and the CEOs of Silicon Valley and the boardrooms of Wall Street, capital was hatching an even more exploitative scheme, which we are now dealing with today. And we're dealing with that through many different tools, some of which is unionization, regulation, and of course the one that we've adopted here is platform cooperativism. So that's the context more broadly. There's a more specific context, though, in New York City. In New York City, before Uber launched in 2011. Before it launched, we had the taxi industry. It was an industry that since the 1960s had been primarily employed immigrant workers and did not classify workers as employees. The taxi-based owners got together and they got the city and state to allow them to misclassify workers as independent contractors with no benefits, no rights in the job, and in fact, with the requirement that they pay to work in the form of leasing out the taxi cabs. This was the exploitative foundation in New York City that Uber came along and built on. When Uber launched in 2011, many drivers in the traditional taxi industry actually felt that it was a better deal because instead of having to pay $1,000 every week for a taxi cab medallion, for a taxi license, they could get a license and drive their own personal car and pay maybe $1,000 a month. So they could decrease their expenses by about 75%. On the flip side, however, Uber was not bound by any of the regulations for the fare, what the rider paid, and wages, what the driver was paid. And so after an initial, you could call it a honeymoon period, where Uber used mountains of venture capital to subsidize the fares and to subsidize wages, the bottom fell out in working conditions. And so around 2017-18, there was a wave of suicide. This tragically resulted in a wave of suicides in the industry where drivers began taking their own lives. 9 drivers that we know of committed suicide because of the disruption and exploitation that Uber and Lyft, we can't forget about them, that the other major corporate platform brought to the industry. So that was the background that the Drivers Cooperative came out of. I mentioned I began organizing unions about 15 years ago. About 5 years ago, I got a job working for a union that was organizing Uber drivers as an education director. And what I heard from drivers was that, yes, we'd love to form a union, but what would be even better is if we owned the platform. And so, dutiful union staffer and wannabe Trotsky that I am, or wannabe Trotsky subordinate that I am, I said, well, let me see what we can do. And so I managed to get a small grant, ran a class about co-ops, and brought the core group of drivers who came together to the Platform Cooperative Consortium conference in New York City. And then in early 2020, we began working on our own to build the co-op. So this was, of course, much more challenging than it seems. Everybody thinks, oh, Uber is just an app. How hard could it be? Well, extremely hard, in fact. What we thought we needed was 5 things: drivers, riders, an app, a staff of managers and professionals who knew how to put those things together to build a company, and capital, of course, to pay for all of it. Most companies start with capital, right? And they use that to pay for staff, pay for workers, run marketing campaigns, and to build technology. We didn't have capital, we had labor. We had to start from the other end. So the strategy that we developed in order to build the company is what I think people refer to as bootstrapping. There's this concept in US culture of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, you can kind of imagine like how impossible that is. Like you're standing on your boots and you're supposed to like pull yourself up. Well, so in economic theory, bootstrapping is of course a ridiculous idea. In terms of building companies, what it means is building companies with very little capital, where you have to, you could say, I like to use the word MacGyver, but that's a US cultural reference that most folks here. MacGyver is a TV character. Okay, people know MacGyver. Great. All right, two cheers for US cultural imperialism. Yeah, so we had to MacGyver together the company, to build it from little bits and pieces that we had lying around. In French, they say bricolage, which I think is another great term. So what did we do to get drivers? We used labor movement strategies of outreach. We tapped into pre-existing networks. Drivers in New York City are already organized in large social media groups, in different organizations. We began running online classes where drivers could come together and learn about this concept of launching your own platform. For riders, we figured the people who started Uber, one of them, they think of this term network effects, which has come up a couple times here, which basically means having a balanced supply and demand so that everybody is getting what they want from the platform. Usually, it's a big chicken and egg problem. So usually, to create network effects, one side of the network is a little bit more critical than the other. They would call that the hard side of the network. In rideshare, that would be drivers. It's also often more expensive to build that side of the network. So recruiting drivers means that people have to go buy cars, right? You have to convince people to change how they're making their living. It's a bigger ask than convincing a consumer to change how they order a cab. So the hard side's the most important side. We decided to start with that. And we decided to hold off on recruiting riders until farther down the road. In terms of technology, we had no money. Right? We managed to, we had crowdfunded a little bit. We had some volunteers in our circles who were engineers. We managed to buy an existing app for about $5,000 and began customizing that for New York City with, I would say, a unrealistically optimistic idea that that was actually going to work. You learn a lot of things. But it was enough that we could put it in the App Store and begin recruiting drivers while we prepared to launch. So with that method, we recruited about 2,500 drivers in New York City. This is out of a total workforce of around 100,000, just for reference. Actually, probably closer to about 70,000 right now. It was a little higher before in the early days of the pandemic. For staff, we reached out to folks who had left some of the big platform companies, some of whom had been unhappy with how exploitative they were. We also, in our own circles, many drivers have business experience and could bring that background to our team. But that was about as far as we could go without any capital. One of our co-founders thought we would be able to get grants from foundations to build the company because obviously the gig economy is such a terrible social problem, and the workforce of drivers in New York City is so exploited. It's a 91% immigrant workforce. Drivers are making maybe $30,000 a year, which in New York City is not enough to live on. Your rent is going to be at least $1,000, $1,500 a month, and this is working full time. So we did not have any success at the beginning of getting any major grants. We also found that traditional investors were not interested in our model. Most startups, the way most startups are funded is by selling equity in the company, equity being ownership. We couldn't do that, of course, because the whole point was that it would be driver-owned. Investors who invest in startups, they're not investing based on thinking they're going to be paid out of the profits of the company. They're investing based on thinking the company is going to eventually go public, sell shares in the stock market, and the shares they bought for very little will be valued at much more, and they'll make their profit through the IPO, or selling their shares in a later round of fundraising. Wasn't an option for us because it's important that drivers own the platform from the beginning to the end. So instead, we had luck approaching, there's a small ecosystem of cooperative movement funders in the US, and we had luck with a fund called Shared Capital Cooperative, which is it's sort of like a credit union for co-ops. They give out loans to companies, and they loaned us $200,000 to get started. We also got support from another fund called LEAF, the Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, Start.coop, and others. I'll show you a slide more about our funding later. That gave us enough money to at least get started. And so at the end of May, we were able to get licensed by the city, and we launched. So what happened then? So the challenges of the first challenge we faced was the challenge of launching. We recruited riders, and we addressed that challenge through a variety of strategies. We recruited drivers through labor organizing strategies. We built technology through essentially bootstrapping, through buying an off-the-shelf white label app. As we got closer to launch, we realized it wasn't going to be ready, and so we ended up working with another local technology company that supplies a lot of other local transportation companies. Unfortunately, we found that that app was not able to do the matching that we needed of matching ride requests and drivers based on geodata. And so that was a problem that we began trying to solve, and we were still working on solving. The other problem, of course, that we had to solve was riders. We solved that problem through what people call earned media, and also through a social movement approach. Earned media is when you don't pay the media to cover you, you get the media to cover you because you have an interesting story. And so our launch was on the front page of the business section of the New York Times. That generated then social media coverage. We had a good relationship with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This event was right in her district in New York City. She retweeted us, and all of our systems collapsed because we were completely overwhelmed with people downloading the app. It was great. I wish she'd tweet about us more. So that got us to the point of launch. We managed to exist. The next phase was the challenge of continuing to exist. And there's actually kind of two parts to that challenge. One is continuing to exist as a company, which means bringing in enough revenue to cover your costs. The other part of the challenge is continuing to exist as a cooperative, which is operating and existing as a company in line with the values of the co-op movement, being owned by drivers, being democratically accountable in our operations. That's the challenge that we're dealing with right now. So often in business strategy, there's this idea of like the deliberate strategy, which is what you say you're going to do or you plan to do. Then there's this other idea of emergent strategy. It's a term maybe folks have heard, which is what you actually end up doing when your strategy meets the reality of the world. So our emergent strategy was in New York City, so where are we now? These are a few slides of where we are right now. In New York City, the transportation sector that we're competing in actually is composed of two subsectors. The smaller circle on the left here is TIM, any MBAs here will know, is total addressable market. All the money that can be made through selling products in this market. The smaller market here is transportation that's supported largely through government funds. New York City, like most US cities, has a paratransit program. Paratransit is transportation for people with disabilities. It's a system that by law has to exist in US cities because people with disabilities have a right to equal access to the transportation system. New York City, the subway system is not wheelchair accessible. And so since the 1990s, the city has had to spend, at this point, I think it's about $500 million a year on providing a system of requesting a wheelchair accessible vehicle for folks who cannot use the subway. A lot of that work is subcontracted out to the taxi industry and black car sector, which we're operating in. There's another subsector of that market called non-emergency medical transportation, which is funded through insurance companies and Medicaid, which is the government insurance system, which is there to ensure that people are able to get to medical appointments. So most of that transportation is pre-scheduled, like scheduled the day before. We found that we were very easily able to compete in that sector even while we were struggling to enter the larger market, which is rideshare. That's Uber and Lyft, which is on demand, which requires a very accurate geolocation data and a sophisticated algorithm that matches ride requests with available drivers, and also requests that you have a large number of drivers on the road and available at any given time, because if riders request rides and don't get one, they'll stop using your app. By the same token, if drivers are online and aren't getting riders, they'll switch over to another app. So we developed a strategy of building our network, creating network effects by first lining up large-scale contracts to provide non-emergency medical transportation and paratransit, using that to create stable income for our members, build an active network of drivers on the road, and then be in a position to add in the on-demand ride requests and enter this much bigger circle here. So that's the emergent strategy we developed, and it's going fairly well. So here's a little timeline of how, okay, so this is our coverage in the New York Times. Here's some of the contracts we've lined up. This is where our initial funding ended up coming from. I should mention here too, while we're talking about funding, we were able to get to launch with small loans, some crowdfunding. What gave us the capital to continue was that we took the momentum of the launch. So we got a lot of media coverage, there was a lot of excitement. We had recruited thousands of drivers this project, tens of thousands of riders, 40,000 riders downloaded the app. We were able to take that momentum and ask people to support the project with their dollars. There's a there are a lot of restrictions about raising capital for companies in the US. You have to be what's called an accredited investor in order to buy a security, to buy stock, or to invest in a private company. Accredited doesn't mean like you have a license, like you can't go like, well actually you can get accredited by taking a bunch of classes and exams if you become a stockbroker anyway. But what it means is that you have a very high income, or you have $1 million in the bank. So most of our support base did not have $1 million in the bank and did not have very high incomes. So we were able to use this system called regulation crowdfunding, which is an exemption from the securities law that allows you to raise money from the general public. We created a special investment vehicle where anybody could invest $100 or more, which was much more in reach than most offerings, to support the co-op. And through that, over 1,000 people invested, and we raised $1.7 million, which was shocking. And that is the money that has allowed us to experiment and continue building and get to where we are right now, which is we are essentially, we have to do the numbers from we're still doing the numbers from last month, but I think we may have actually become profitable at this point in our first full year of operation. Yeah. So we exist, and we will continue to exist. So let me talk now about some of the challenges of the future. We're still right now our highest in order to enter this much larger. So right now, what are we doing? We're probably doing around 700 trips every day in New York City, mostly in this smaller sub-market while we prepare to launch into the larger market. The key resource we need in order to be able to do that is better technology. And so we have a team of software engineers who are building an app which is going to allow us to compete in that sector. We're also getting ready to share that technology with other cooperatives worldwide who are interested. We've been running online classes, an online academy for drivers or allies from anywhere in the world who want to start similar cooperatives. And once our technology is ready, which should be later this year, we will be able to share that with co-ops in other cities. We're also looking for engineers and other technology cooperatives to be part of that network and ecosystem because for every co-op that uses this platform, there's going to need to be customizations and, of course, continual upgrades. So this is essentially where things stand. We have met the challenge of continuing to exist. The big challenge will be growth. We're solving that challenge mostly through developing new technology, which will be something like open source, but restricted to co-op use. And I would say the other challenge is existing as a cooperative. And for that, to be honest, that has not been the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge has been making money, existing as a business. But just to say a few words about our structure, we're 100% driver-owned. I'm one of the only people in the co-op who's not actually working as a driver. I do have a taxi license, but I haven't made my living that way. Right now, we have our structure is that we have a board of directors which has seats for both, the majority is for drivers, minority is for staff of the co-op. At this point, most of our staff are either current or former drivers. And then we have seats for independent advisors. We also have the board of directors set strategy. We then have a leadership team, which is a management team, which hires and supervises a staff. That leadership team is now majority drivers. And we have a separate board, which is elected and is made up only of drivers, which has 18 seats with representation for it's a very diverse industry. And one thing that we've found historically in New York, there have sometimes been conflicts in organizations like ours between people of different backgrounds. And so we've set up a structure so that the seats are allocated so there's some representation from drivers of the main different ethnic groups or all the different ethnic groups in the industry. We have a plebiscite process where if any group of drivers feels like they're underrepresented, they can trigger a referendum to get a seat. So we're experimenting with quite a lot of things, but all in all, I'd say that our co-op is basically aligned for growth. It's all just a lot of work, but it's also very possible. If a year ago I don't think I knew I'd be on the stage saying we had paid $4.5 million. That's a lot of $1 million to drivers so far this year. Next year at this time, I hope that we are, well, who knows where we'll be, but some predictions. We will have a co-op sourced app that will be available to driver-owned cooperatives anywhere in the world. We will have relaunched into rideshare in New York City, and we will be gaining market share and competing effectively with Uber and Lyft, with the major players. And we'll hopefully be one node in a network of driver-owned cooperatives worldwide that are proving that this is not just an alternative, it's the future. So.